This research paper had a 5,000-word limit and was written in the Chicago format. This paper used Dr. Gregory Stanton's 10 Steps to Genocide as its definition for what a genocide is in order to analyze how slavery fit within the concepts of genocide. In order to provide evidence, the paper used primary sources, including but not limited to slave codes and slave laws from numerous states in both northern and southern regions, slave passes, newspaper articles, newspaper advertisements, slave narratives, journals from both slave traders and slave masters, contracts, receipts, census papers, and more. The transatlantic slave trade supported the human trafficking of approximately 12.5 million people of African descent. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, European traders exchanged goods such as guns, bullets, and clothes with African traders in exchange for African captives. These African captives were forced to relocate to various Caribbean countries such as Brazil. While in these countries, Africans were forced to grow various crops such as coffee, tobacco, rice, and sugar. The first slaves were not brought to America at the time of the British New World until 1619 in Virginia under Governor George Yeardley. Approximately 20 African slaves were brought to Virginia, initiating the transatlantic slave trade in British territory. Dr. Gregory Stanton founded both the Genocide Watch and the Alliance Against Genocide in 1999. In 1981, he founded the Cambodian Genocide Project. In 1992 through 1999, he worked for the U.S. State Department. In 1994, he received the American Foreign Service Association's prestigious W. Averill Harriman Award for the work he performed on the Rwandan genocide. And he has received diplomas from Oberlin College, Harvard Divinity School, Yale Law School, and the University of Chicago. The 10 steps to genocide may occur collectively at the same time or independently. They are classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and denial. Classification is separating people into categories. Examples of classification are categorizing individuals by race, heritage, religion, and nationality. Symbolization, the second step, is defined as separating people into distinguishable groups with negative intentions. The third step, discrimination, is defined as denying people rights based on the group they are associated with. The fourth step, dehumanization, is when a group of people are compared to animals. Organization is defined as a group of people designated to enforce policies on another group. Polarization, the sixth step, is propaganda that reinforces hate towards a group of people or laws that prevent social interactions between a group of people. Preparation, the seventh step. During this step, specific groups of people are targeted by civilians so that they are no longer accepted by society. Step 8, persecution, is separating a group of people from a society based on their heritage or religion and creating a death list. Extermination, the ninth step, is the mass killing of a group of people. Rape can also be used to genetically modify the race in an attempt to eradicate a group of people, and sometimes corpses are disrupted. The 10th and final step, denial, is when those guilty of committing acts of genocide deny or try to cover up their actions. Slave codes initially began in the settlement of Jamestown. As mixed couples started to develop, the colonial leaders created rules to keep races separate in society. As slave codes evolved, they became a way for leaders to set expectations for slave owners, such as providing adequate food and shelter for their slaves. However, in addition to setting slave owner expectations, they set restrictions upon slaves. Each colony was responsible for their own codes. After the American Revolution in 1776, slave codes were adapted by states and would be known as slave laws. States such as Alabama, Louisiana, and Virginia had similar laws that prohibited white people from marrying freed blacks and slaves. Not only did the laws have punishments for those who violated the rule, but there were laws against people in power, such as the justice of the peace or priests, from overseeing a mixed wedding. On occasions where white people were found to be in relationships with blacks, the white person was thought to have defiled their bodies or dishonored God. Both people in the marriage would receive punishments, as well as those who oversaw the wedding. When the first slaves were brought to Virginia in 1619, merchant John Rolfe recorded the slaves in his journal as negars, spelled Negars. This term is thought to have derived from the Spanish term nigger, which translates to black. The term would eventually evolve into the N-word by the early 1800s and be used as a derogatory term used towards black people. In Hosea Easton's book, A Treatise on the Intellectual Character and Civil and Political Condition of the Colored People of the United States, and the Prejudice exercised towards them, written in 1837, Easton noted that the N-word was used to show that blacks were less important than whites. The use of the N-word distinguished blacks from the white community and was used to remind blacks of their place in society. Another term that will be used to represent the black community is the word Negro. The term Negro comes from the Latin word nigger and means black in both Spanish and Portuguese. Negro was thought to be the proper term to use when referring to the black community, as opposed to the N-word, which was meant to be an insult. The term will be used in most slave codes when referring to free blacks. An example of this is Louisiana's Code of 1724, Rule 34. The word Negro will be socially acceptable when referring to blacks until the 1970s. Another example of symbolization is that slave codes in some areas required the slaves to have documentation to travel. These documents would be known as slave passes. By requiring slaves to have documentation, it required them to identify themselves. Slaves were also not allowed to sell or buy anything without permission and the proper paperwork saying they could buy or sell things from their owner. The first two categories, classification and symbolization, can be seen working collectively in discrimination because they set limitations as well as distinguish blacks from the rest of the community by use of derogatory terms and slave passes. Discrimination was also shown because slaves were not allowed to own anything. Slaves were also not allowed to have a will passing anything down because everything belonged to the slave owner. Slaves were considered to be real estate, and slavery was a lifelong hereditary status position. If you were born into slavery, you would always be considered a slave. Slave traders would post ads to sell slaves in the newspaper, the same way one can post an ad for puppies in the newspaper today. Slave auctions were also held for those who were interested in buying or selling slaves. While in auctions, slaves might possibly be asked to dance or given physical exams so that buyers knew they were receiving a healthy slave. When plantation owners bought slaves, they were issued receipts that demonstrated slaves as their new property. On some occasions, slaves would be permanently branded or marked to show which slave ship they were imported from, for punishment or to signify who they belonged to. In order to show ownership, some slave owners would brand slaves with their initials or a specific symbol. Slave owners would brand all their slaves, while other owners only branded runaways to ensure their return. In addition to this, slaves were also recognized as chattel property. Slave patrol was originally developed in fear of slave uprisings. After the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793, slave patrol became more frequent and would be used to help find missing slaves. White people who helped slaves faced a fine between $500 to $1,000 or a year in jail. Slave patrol was different in every state, as some states, such as Virginia, had patrol in every county, while other states ran solely based on volunteers. Polarization, classification, dehumanization, and discrimination work together collectively in Step 6. Besides many states having slave codes against mixed relationships, there were also some states that had social laws as well. Some states, such as Alabama, created laws against white people housing blacks unless the slave belonged to them. The law made it clear that slaves from different plantations were not allowed to mingle, even for weddings, and had consequences for both slaves who violated these laws by visiting other plantations and plantation owners who had allowed slaves who were not his to congregate together. In Alabama, plantation owners were not allowed to have slaves that did not belong to them on their plantation for any longer than 4 hours at a time, and this was only if they were renting a slave from another master. Other states, such as South Carolina, required that plantation owners didn't dress slaves above their social class and designated certain fabrics to be used for slaves. Slaves were also not allowed to read or write. The enforcement of slave laws regarding literacy was an attempt to control the thought process and limit the cohesiveness of the slaves. The rationale for not teaching literacy skills was the fear that literacy would allow slaves the ability to forge slave passes, create maps, and plan revolts. When preparation usually occurs, people are forced to leave their homes and relocate to internment camps. Even though during slavery, slaves were not placed in internment camps, American slavery in itself, however, was the forceful relocation of approximately 380,000 African slaves. Slaves were continuously sold and resold, which required them to relocate frequently and most of the time be separated from their families. Previous steps collectively worked together with persecution such as symbolization and discrimination because slaves were not allowed to have property. If the slaves were not allowed to have property, how can something be stolen? Slaves are murdered throughout slavery for numerous petty crimes. The 7-step preparation also works collectively with persecution because slaves were being forcefully relocated. Due to the Middle Passage and the Atlantic slave trade, many slaves died before making it into America. Approximately 1.8 million slaves died on slave ships while traveling on the Middle Passage. As a result, their bodies were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean. The Middle Passage was one stop of a 3-part journey many ships sailed to reach America. On some occasions, slaves also died at the hands of slave patrol, overseers, or plantation owners. Persecution was shown through the slave codes and laws put in place to govern slaves. In Louisiana in 1724, slaves who ran away were given harsh consequences and could even be put to death depending on how many times they had previously ran away. However, because slavery had such an impact on the Southern economy, death lists were never created to purposefully kill slaves. Persecution and extermination also simultaneously worked together. This was shown because if it was deemed necessary by an overseer or plantation owner, they would murder more than one enslaved person. We also see extermination used in slave massacres. Most of the time, massacres only happened in situations of slave revolt. One example of this was an estimated 100 slaves were murdered by a revolt led by Nat Turner. Another example of this is the 1811 slave revolt in Louisiana. It was one of the largest slave revolts in the South. Approximately 500 New Orleans slaves marched downstream and killed 2 white men, before battling a group of local militia and a military. As a result of this, dozens of slaves were murdered and some beheaded on their plantations, and their heads were placed on poles. Aside from massacres, slaves also experienced rape and sexual abuse. In 1853, Virginia Boyd, a Texas slave, wrote a letter to R.C. Ballard, a slave trader, asking him to reinforce to her slave master that she didn't need to be sold. Boyd's reasoning being that she was pregnant by her master and had already previously given birth to many of his children. Boyd also wrote to Ballard about the previous children she birthed for her master, stating, "It's hard indeed, and what is still harder for the father of my children, to sell his own offspring, yes, his own flesh and blood." Despite Boyd's effort to keep her family together, she was eventually resold and separated from her children. The United States has not recognized slavery as a genocide. Therefore, it could be said that there is a denial of the idea that slavery was a genocide of the African American people. Some states, such as Texas, do not teach slavery as a reason for the Civil War, and instead they teach states' rights. This displays denial because it is as if they don't want to teach the concept, either because they realize it was wrong and don't want to admit they're wrong, or because they don't see the problem with the acts of slavery. In addition to all states not teaching slavery as a cause for the Civil War, there has been a recent uproar over teachers teaching critical race theory in schools. Critical race theory is the concept that racism is not just a social problem, but a problem that can be reflected in a country's laws. This theory was created by legal experts Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Those who argue that critical race theory should not be taught in schools feel as if the theory pinpoints all white people to be oppressors to blacks. As a result of this, 9 states, including Oklahoma and Arizona, have been teaching the concept of racism in public schools. Another way denial is shown is the Natchez Trace Parkway. The Natchez Trace is a 444-mile route stretching over Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee that many slaves had to walk while being forcefully relocated during slavery. The route was originally used by American Indians. Today, the route is primarily used for hiking, cycling, camping, and overall great scenery. Those who visit the Natchez Trail Parkway can rent cabins, sightsee, and enjoy festivals. However, along the route there is only one memorial, and that is for the War of 1812, honoring those who fought for American independence. There is no monument to represent the slaves who were forced to travel the route. This exhibits denial because the full history of the route and what it is used for is not being taught. In addition to the War of 1812, somewhere along the 444-mile route, at least one plaque or monument could have been put up to represent the slaves who were forced to walk the route. Many southern states have created monuments for the Civil War. However, instead of honoring the lives of the many people who suffered during slavery, they honor those who were members of the Confederate Army. In 2016, it was estimated that over 1,500 public areas have a monument or symbol dedicated to the Confederate Army. This includes, but is not limited to, statues, highways, parks, and even schools. Besides just monuments, many Americans in the southern region see no problem with flying the flag for the Confederate States of America. Many Americans justify flying the Confederate flag because they see it as a symbol of heritage and a symbol of honor to the Southern soldiers who lost their life during the Civil War. Americans who honored the Confederate flag do not see the Confederate Army as terrorists who are trying to overthrow the government, but instead as soldiers who were defending the right to not be overtaxed. The usage of Stanton's 10 Steps to Genocide helped to expose the implications slavery had on the African American community by applying slave codes, slave laws, and personal narratives. Characteristics of all 10 steps: classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, and denial can be seen in slavery. The usage of slave codes and slave laws were important in showing the cause of treatment to slaves and how they related to different steps. The use of personal narratives helped to show a first-hand account of the codes and laws' physical and emotional effect on slaves. Slavery is still a sensitive subject in America today for both white and black Americans. This is shown through states not wanting to teach slavery as a cause for the Civil War, and some states not teaching racism at all. However, regardless of it being a sensitive subject, slavery has had an everlasting impact on American society.